Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to the letter O of the alphabet of favourite films list. There's not that many films in the letter O on my list, but there are some really good ones. Again, one of the points of this series is for you to let me know your favourite films, and I would really like to see your letter O selections. So without further ado, let's start, shall we? So the first film is Odds Against Tomorrow from Robert Wise from 1959, a film that probably wouldn't get made now. It stars Harry Belafonte, who produced the film as well, and co-stars Robert Ryan and Ed Begley as an ill-fitting trio of robbers who plan the perfect crime, which obviously doesn't go perfectly. But the thing that makes this film stand out is the race element between Robert Ryan and Harry Belafonte. Robert Ryan, who did make a habit of playing some bigots in his career, plays an overtly racist guy, complete with language, and he obviously doesn't really want to work with Harry Belafonte, but circumstances kind of force him to. And so you've got the tension between the three characters, and you've also got the tension between planning a robbery and performing the robbery. And it's a really interesting film, and again, it wouldn't be made now, because through their kind of adventures or misadventures, the usual Hollywood kind of story is, they would understand each other, and they would, come to accept their differences but somehow work together. That doesn't happen in Odds Against Tomorrow. They are still the same men at the end of the film, and would rather do themselves harm than actually escape. It's a bleak film, but it's also truthful, I think, because a lot of times these films where you have this really racist character, but then by the end of the film, they've kind of understood the other person's perspective, and isn't necessarily how the world actually works. Odds Against Tomorrow kind of shows the world probably closer to what it is, and it is kind of sad that 60 years later we haven't really moved on that much. It's another one of those really interesting films from Robert Wise filmography. Again, Robert Wise is never going to appear in people's greatest directors lists, but he did make some really interesting, odd little films in different genres. Also, The Haunting was in my letter H. I would check it out. BFI have done a nice job resurrecting this one. Again, not a popular film. And speaking of not really a popular or feel-good film, it's The Offence with Sidney Lumet, with Sean Connery, Trevor Howard and Ian Bannon. I talked about it on my top 10 Sean Connery that isn't Bond. Connery goes to a real dark place as a bad lieutenant, on the trail of a child murderer or child molester. Yeah, it's the way it's kind of shot is a little bit point blanky, as far as it is a little avant-garde for like a mainstream film. It's set in a grey, depressing North England town, and Connery is quite happy to show himself as a really unpleasant character. Not an enjoyable watch, but a watch that you should watch. Next on the list is Oh What a Lovely War from 1969, directed by Richard Attenborough, which bizarrely still hasn't had a Blu-ray release. I'm not really sure why. It is Paramount, so that might explain why. But again, I'm not the biggest fan of Richard Attenborough, and at 2.5 hours, this should probably be trimmed a little bit. It's based on the musical about World War One. It has arguably one of the greatest casts ever assembled, from Larry Olivier and Kenneth Moore and John Gielgud and Maggie Smith and Ian Holm, Jack Hawkins, Ralph Richardson, Susanna York, Edward Fox. There's 2 members of the Mills family in it. There's 3 Redgraves in it. And it's a bleak musical about World War One. It is kind of split into 2 parts. It follows the Smith family, who are a working class family who 3 generations of them end up going in the war and being slaughtered. And it also cuts between trench warfare excuse me, trench warfare and this Brighton Beach scene where all the gentry and all the colonels and politicians are pretty much having caviar and champagne and dancing and kind of joking about the war being like cricket and all of that. So it really shows the 2 sides. The final scene before CGI is just jaw-dropping as far as the kind of scale of the slaughter of the First World War. There's a beautiful scene that kind of encapsulates the whole idea of these poor people basically for king and country just getting slaughtered. It's kind of in a music hall, and Maggie Smith, they're doing a recruitment run and using Maggie Smith, who looks very glamorous from a distance, and coercing all these guys to go and volunteer. And then when they actually come up on stage and see Maggie Smith in close up, she's caked and really bad makeup and she's got bad teeth, and that kind of just sums up how these poor people were basically just led to the slaughter in the First World War. The songs, it's got 2 or 3 really good songs, but not all the songs work, and that maybe kind of brings it back a little bit. And again, it's probably a little overlong, like all of Richard Attenborough films are. But it makes so many really good points. Again, the last scene is just heartbreaking and quite moving, and it really needs a Blu-ray. It's something that Arrow Academy really needs to get their finger out, or Indicator or somebody, or Eureka Masters of Cinema. But again, it's Paramount, and for some reason they just don't want to release Blu-rays of things. Parallax View, which, spoiler alert, may appear in the letter P, is another example. Yeah, Oh What a Lovely War, which is obviously not literal. Next on the list is an essential edition from Indicator. It's David Mamet's Oleana. Again, I've done a random review on this. It obviously appeared in my top 10 David Mamet. It's what cinema at its best is about, which is challenging the audience, making the audience feel uncomfortable. It's a two-hander with Bill Macy and Deborah Eisenstadt, who was the stand-in when it did its theatre run, because this was based on a Mamet play, a play which bizarrely I actually saw in London, with Dennis Lawson, Ewan McGregor's uncle, in the lead. It's about a professor and a college student. It's about sexual politics, and it's a great couple movie to drive a wedge between couples, because there will be at times where you are on the professor's side, there is times where you are on the student side, and you will flip-flop about 6 times during the film, and depending on your socio-political view, it will pretty much depend on whose side you're on. It's just one of those films that you can just discuss for hours afterwards, probably with heated arguments. It's stunning that you can make a two-hander riveting, but that's what Mamet does. He opens the play up a little bit, but not extensively. It's just a stunning, argumentative film that you really ought to see. Now a film that everybody probably has seen. It's the first Omen film. This was a film that its deaths are legendary. When you see it when you're younger, it is rather creepy. It still remains a little creepy. You're still shocked that Gregory Peck is involved in this. Directed by Richard Donner, who would go on to do Lethal Weapon. The stories behind the production and the cursed production, you could argue sometimes are more interesting than the actual film. The fact that at the end of the film Gregory Peck is trying to kill his son, and during the filming his own son committed suicide. They hired a light aircraft to do overhead shots, but they had to cancel, and then on the day that they were going to shoot, the pilot actually crashed, and the rumour goes that he crashed into a car in the town, and in the car was his wife and daughter. There's another story about, I think, the makeup artist who was in a car accident after the filming and his passenger was decapitated. Yeah. Whether all of these stories are true or whether they're actually urban legend, it just kind of builds to the legend of the Omen. The second one's okay with William Holden. The third one's not really that good with Sam Neill. The fourth one's not really worth mentioning, and I haven't even seen the remake. I mean, the original has one of the great endings of all time. It has such a stellar cast. David Warner and Patrick Troughton and Billy Whitelaw. It has wonderful set pieces in it. It's just tremendous fun. I mean, I know, people disagree, but I prefer it to The Exorcist. I think it stands up better than The Exorcist does. The Omen. Next on the list, we're back to Robert Ryan in Nicholas Ray's wonderful On Dangerous Ground. For years, he just couldn't get this even on DVD, and then I bought a Spanish Blu-ray, and obviously the Premium Collection released it. It's from 1952. It was kind of butchered a bit. It stars Robert Ryan as essentially a Dirty Harry character who likes to beat up criminals and takes it too far, so he's told to go out into the country to cool off after another beating up of a suspect, and he is involved in the story of someone who's been murdered and it's a relative of Ida Lupino who's blind, and Robert Ryan kind of starts having feelings for her, but can't really escape who he is and what he is. It's a wonderful film. Again, I think it threw people because it starts off as being this tough, city cops and robbers film, and then it goes out to the country, it's snowbound, and it becomes something else. It becomes something more lyrical. It's a great performance by the two leads. It's one of Nicholas Ray's finest films, but I don't think it's as well known as his other works. Next on the list is Once Upon a Time in America by Sergio Leone. I think this is the full 251 minute version, but there's so many different versions of the film. It's not my favourite Sergio Leone. It's probably the one of his films where the characters aren't actually that likeable, because De Niro's character, James Woods' character, they do fairly despicable things, especially to women. And you could argue that the kind of downside to the film is they're not actually that likeable, whereas characters in his other films, despite the bad things they do, you still kind of like them in some level. But it is just a magisterial film. It just looks amazing, sounds amazing. You're in the hands of a master. It's one of his bleakest films. There's not a lot of joy or light or fun to be had in this one. It's perhaps a little overlong, but kind of every frame of a Sergio Leone film, there's always something interesting in it, because he is one of the greatest visual artists of all time, even though he didn't actually make that many films. So you can probably guess what's next on the list. It's Once Upon a Time in the West, and I apologise, but I'm going to talk about this for a little while. Growing up, let me tell you a story. Growing up, before I knew what cinema was, The Good, the Bad and Ugly was just one of my favourite films of all time before I even knew. It was just so much fun, this sadistic relationship between Lee Van Cleef, Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallace characters that would shoot each other in the back without thinking, but also have this respect, a kind of professional respect for each other. It's the kind of relationship that has never been bettered. So I must have seen The Good, the Bad and Ugly probably 30 or 40 times before I ever saw Once Upon a Time in the West, because for some reason Once Upon a Time in the West had kind of been forgotten about, and when I was growing up, the Dollars trilogy were the ones that were on the television, Good, the Bad and Ugly the most. But I had read about Once Upon a Time in the West, I had read about how amazing it is, I had read about the opening sequence when the three characters are waiting for the train. But being the contrarian I am, until I actually saw it, I took that with a grain of salt. And then BBC Two were doing a Western series, and one of the films was Once Upon a Time in the West, and this must have been the first time it was on television for years. Certainly in my lifetime I'd never remembered it being on the television. So I recorded it on VHS, a tape which later I would wear out at certain bits because I would rewatch it so often. And then I remember watching the film for the first time, and when you watch a great film for the first time, you kind of wish you could bottle that feeling, because I remember just being blown away by it. I remember it actually being quite an emotional experience, because you're literally just going, look at that shot, 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 look at that shot. I mean, it's one of those films that you hear about that actually lives up to the hype and goes beyond the hype. So for me now, it's actually my favourite Sergio Leone. It's better than The Good, the Bad and Ugly. You could argue it's not as much fun. It's not as much sadistic fun as The Good, the Bad and Ugly, but it is the better film. It's, for me, the greatest Western ever made. The fact that Leone, Bertolucci, Dario Argento sat around a villa watching Westerns, and then they came up with a Western that's better than the sum of its parts. It's part Shane, it's part High Noon, it's part other American Westerns, but it's better than all of them combined. I know people say, High Noon and Shane are amazing. They may be, but they're not Once Upon a Time in the West. Once Upon a Time in the West is the perfect example of why cinema is just so amazing. You could write a book of Once Upon a Time in the West, but it would not be as good, I don't care who's reading it and who's imagining it, as the film Once Upon a Time in the West. When I first got my projector, which I watch my films in 100 inches on a wall, the first film that I watched was Once Upon a Time in the West on it. It is pure cinema. It's 165 minutes, but it does not feel 165 minutes. Tarantino could learn from that. The opening 15 minutes, or whatever it is at the station, is just absolute genius with Jack Elam and Woody Strode, and I apologise because I can't remember who the Italian actor is, when they're doing their knuckles and waiting in the drip and playing for the fly. Clint Eastwood never understood Sergio Leone's long takes and all these setups and why he would do that. Clint Eastwood came more from the Don Siegel economical, not necessarily amazing compositions. Clint Eastwood's obviously not as good a director as Don Siegel or Sergio Leone, but he never understood Sergio Leone's art, essentially. It's a masterpiece in every level. Oh, by the way, you've also got Ennio Morricone's remarkable score. There's a wonderful DVD set of Ennio Morricone playing live in Venice, and they do the theme, Jill's theme from Once Upon a Time in the West. There's a soprano in a red dress that comes out and performs it, and I'm not ashamed to say that I wept at it. It's just like overwhelmingly emotional when that soprano sang it. It was just beautiful. It is one of the handful of films that if I was to be pinned down to what my favourite film of all time would be, Once Upon a Time in the West would be in it. We haven't even spoken about Claudia Cardinal's fantastic performance. Even though half the time she looks dubbed, half the time she looks as though she's speaking English. You have Jason Robards, who is just wonderful. Again, he plays a bad man. He plays a robber, he plays a killer. But there is just something so charming and endearing about him. He's just fantastic. You've got Charles Bronson as this almost vengeful ghost who's never been better, never been cooler. He gets all the best lines. And then you have Henry Fonda, who gives arguably one of his best turns as Frank, who blows away kids, and it's just the way he walks, the way he looks. I mean, Henry Fonda is just beautiful in this film, and his dark fury. It's a film about myth making. It's a film about the end of an era, because as soon as the trains come and the modern world comes, it's the end of an era for people like Henry Fonda, who wants to pretend that he's actually a businessman, but at the end of the day he is just a killer and a thug. It's the end of an era for Charles Bronson. Jason Robards can't move on from this world. The only person that can actually move forward into the future is Claudia Cardinale's character. It is again, I just wish you could go back every time and watch it for the first time. It's an overwhelming experience. It's cinema at its best. It's cinema at its purest. If Sergio Leone had never made another film, he would still be in the list of greatest filmmakers of all time just for Once Upon a Time in the West. It takes like 45 minutes and the main story hasn't even started, but you don't care because it's so immersive. Every frame is just dripping with genius. The shot compositions are just out of this world. Strange enough, I don't think I can recommend it enough. It is just one of those films that you just go, that's cinema. It couldn't exist in any other form. Again, you could write a book, you could do a novelisation of it, it just wouldn't be the same. It's phenomenal. It's one of the greatest films ever made. I apologise for the rant, but I love Once Upon a Time in the West so much. Anyway, on with the show. One Cut of the Dead. Again, I've done a random review. Nazarene Production did a random review, or a review. It's a wonderful genre film that you think is going to be one thing, and to be honest, it's not that interesting, and then it changes in the last 2/3, and it becomes something really heartwarming, really funny, really wonderful. Next on the list is another film that's only available on DVD. It's One False Move by Carl Franklin, the early 90s, starring the wonderful Bill Paxton as a small town sheriff who has secrets, and he is on a collision course with this gang from LA who perform a rather brutal crime at the start of the film, and then it kind of changes to this character study. It stars Michael Beach and Billy Bob Thornton, and I think it might have been Billy Bob Thornton's first film or one of his early films. I think he co-wrote it. You think it's going to be one thing because it does start off as this hard-boiled, quite violent and nasty film, and then it kind of changes to a kind of character study about how our past catches up with us, the side that we show people, and then our hidden life, our hidden side. It's quite a beautiful film, and again, is it's Paramount as well? No, it's Columbia. Powerhouse Indicator, are you listening? I don't know why it doesn't have a Blu-ray, because it's a beautiful, beautiful film. It's kind of like a modern western, but not. Next on the list is Kaneto Shindo's Onibaba, which is a strange little film set in feudal Japan about a mother and daughter who trap and kill wandering samurai to sell off their armour. But it kind of takes dark turns. It was one of the first kind of Japanese films that I saw that really kind of addressed or showed a real kind of sexuality, a real kind of link between sex and violence, and really naked brutality, if you'll pardon the pun. Kuroneko, Shindo's next film, is well worth checking out as well. That's Onibaba. Next on the list is one of the best films of the last 20 years, Jim Jarmusch's Only Lovers Left Alive. This just gives me an excuse to show off my plain archive edition, which I don't really need any excuse to show off. Talk about a film that really drips with atmosphere. Again, it appeared in my vampire list, it appeared in my Jarmusch top 10. I think I did a random review of it. It's just, again, it's atmosphere. If you're familiar with Jarmusch, you know what it's going to be. If you're unfamiliar with Jarmusch, it might take a little while to get used to the pacing. Great performances by Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston, who I'm not the biggest fan of, but it's really one of the few vampire films that addresses what it's like to actually be 200 years old or 400 years old. The things you would actually experience. Like Tom Hiddleston is a music expert, and he's seen musicians and artists and poets for all those years, and it really goes into that side of vampirism that isn't really kind of talked about too much in other films. It's a beautiful film. John Hurt gives a wonderful turn as well. The soundtrack by Squirrel is very good, very moody. It's set in a decaying Detroit and a kind of romanticised but kind of decaying Tangiers. It's one of Jarmusch's best films, and again, it's one of the best films of the 21st century. Please go and see it and spread the word. Next on the list is a lovely little Spanish film, The Orphanage. When I say lovely, I mean kind of a little bit creepy and unsettling. About invisible friends. I'm not going to say too much about it, apart from there is a couple of moments that are genuinely creepy, and the final kind of reveal is blackly comic and obviously tragic. The Orphanage. Next on the list is a film that has been in my life for a long time, but it still remains like you're seeing it for the first time, and it is almost like a dream. It's Jean Cocteau's Orpheus from 1950, starring Jean Marais as the title and Maria Day as Eurydice and Maria Cazares essentially as Death. It's a modern retelling of Orpheus and the underworld, set in contemporary France. Orpheus is a poet and a writer. It's a strange film, but it's also, again, kind of shows you what's possible with cinema. Cocteau uses simple camera techniques to create this kind of otherworldly world. That doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's absolutely beautiful, lyrical, poetic. This and Beauty and the Beast are two masterpieces. It's just fantastic. We're getting there, not too many left. Next on the list is another Orson Welles film, Othello. This Criterion edition, spine number 870, has two versions, the 1952 version, which is 93 minutes, and the 1955 version, which is 91 minutes. Again, this is Orson Welles playing another Shakespearean tragic hero. Not sure hero is the right word. The fact it was shot, in 5 different countries over 10 different time periods, it is amazing how coherent it is. The imagery, as with all Orson Welles films, is stunning. He can't make a bad shot. It's kind of a textbook on shot composition. Welles again gives a wonderful performance. He always called himself a king actor, as far as he can play kings very well and authority figures and stuff, and he's fantastic in this. But also Michael McLemore, which I apologise, that's butchered his name, is wonderful as Iago. Obviously, Jealousy is a green-eyed monster. Next on the list again is a film that I've talked about quite often. It's Outland with Sean Connery, or High Noon in Space. even though it's better than High Noon. Great support from James B. Seeking, and Peter Boyle plays another slimy character. Sean Connery is a really kind of world-weary marshal who's sent to a mining colony. It's funny because it could almost exist in the same universe as Alien. You could imagine the Nostromo dropping off or picking up some ore from this mining colony. Francis Sternhagen as the Doctor, the crotchety old Doctor who kind of forms this bond with Sean Connery. The banter between the two of them is just priceless. It's kind of right up there with George C. Scott and Ed Flanders in Exorcist 3 as far as that banter and that relationship. It's great stuff. It's a wonderful genre film directed by Peter Hyams, and it really needs a bit more exposure. Next on the list, which won't make the final list, this is just complete cheese, but it's Outlander with Jim Caviezel and John Hurt, and Ron Perlman, who gives a wonderful turn. It's about Vikings and spacemen and big alien things. How can you go wrong with that? Jim Caviezel crash lands in a different world in a different time, and it just so happens to be the time of the Vikings. The number of times that's happened to me, it's unbelievable. But unfortunately he has a stowaway on his ship, which is one of these big beasties that his kind try to wipe from a planet. It turns out his kind aren't really that nice, and it does kind of also harken to our questions about what we're doing to this planet. It's just wonderful, dumb fun. Again, John Hurt plays it to the hilt as if it was Shakespeare. Jim Caviezel is likeable as the hero out of time and out of another planet. Again, this won't make the list of my top films of all time, but it's just hugely enjoyable and complete hokum. But sometimes you're just in the mood for complete hokum. And finally, which is completely opposite to Outlander, The Oxbow Incident, William Wellman's 75-minute lynching western classic, starring Henry Fonda with his sidekick Henry Morgan. If you don't know who Henry Morgan is, if you Google his face, you'll know who Henry Morgan is. And Dana Andrews and Anthony Quinn. So it's about a murder. 3 people who just happen to be around are caught by the lynching party, by the mob. Posse, that's the word I was looking for. And it's just whether they're going to get hung or not. Whether they did it or not. It's about the mob mentality. It's about McCarthyism. But strangely enough, there's no happy ending. Spoiler alert, but the film was made in the 40s. It's supposed to be hopeful at the end, but I'm not really sure it actually is. It's quite bleak. Henry Fonda, it's an interesting turn for him because it's not a purely good guy who's pointing out that everybody's wrong. He kind of is almost just going along with the ride. He's crotchety, he's a bit of an arse. So he's not playing, a puritanical, completely good guy. It almost prefigures Frank from Once Upon a Time in the West a little bit. Sorry, just another mention of Once Upon a Time in the West. Yeah, it's only 75 minutes. It flies by. It's a really nice print by Arrow Academy. It's a great wee film. Again, for years it wasn't available and it was kind of not talked about and overlooked. So it's good that it's actually now on Blu-ray. If only we could get that for every film. we want in Blu-ray, but we're just greedy. So thanks very much for watching. Again, there's not that many films on my list for the letter O, but some of them are really, really, really good. So please let me know your films of the letter O, and hopefully we'll see you again for the letter P. Spoiler alert. So this is Saul Giron saying so thank you so much for watching, and hopefully we'll see you again. Farewell.